Welcome to Spotlight on the Real Science of Sport podcast with Professor Ross Tucker and Gareth Davies.
Yes, welcome indeed, folks, to the Spotlight, the Science of Sport's sort of news, discourse-focused show. Today should be quite a fun one, actually. If there's a common theme running through it, it's related to fatigue and performance and how the brain regulates pacing, specifically in the context of two events that happened over the weekend that have given us much food for discussion and for thought. That discussion initially happens over on our VIP platform, which is called Discourse. You become a Discourse member by making a monthly pledge to become a patron of the Real Science of Sport podcast. There'll be a link, as always, in the show notes. And if you enjoy what we do and would like to support, and also hear and read what other listeners are talking about, not just events at the weekend, but all sorts of sports science topics, that's exactly how you do it. So we know that, as I mentioned this last week, actually, we've had a period of a lot of news focus with world champs and then cycling news and so on. So we've tried to shift the spotlight back in a more sort of physiological direction, and as luck would have it, the weekend gave us plenty of topics that do exactly that. So we're going to dive into some of those. We start, as always, with the Discourse Digest, and joining me, as always, from Wales is Gareth Davey, who's going to tee up the first story, which I must be honest came up last week, and I thought, come on, we've got exactly what we wanted.
Yeah, exactly what you wanted, because the news came in that Femke Bol, the 400-meter hurdler, she's going to switch to the 800 meters starting in 2026, which is a bit of a bolt out of the blue, with Sydney McLaughlin-Levrone leaving the hurdles to run the 400 flat. Femke's bailed out of the hurdles and is heading for the 800. So there's a few things to unpick here, not least the physiology of the whole thing. So let's start off. Why do you think she's chosen to do this now?
Well, I suppose we can just take her at her own word, right, and say that she's looking for a new challenge. I imagine the presence of Sydney McLaughlin-Levrone has to factor into that somehow, right? I mean, it's not, you can't exactly avoid and ignore that. But maybe it's difficult to know, but maybe in the last couple of years, they've looked at it and they've said, look, you're winning the 400-meter hurdles every time you race, with the exception of when you race McLaughlin-Levrone.
Which isn't often.
Which isn't often because of how infrequently she races it. And who knows what's going to happen in 26, 27. I'm pretty sure McLaughlin-Levrone wants to head back to the hurdles by 28, because she would almost certainly, right? Would you agree? She wants to win double gold in Los Angeles, you'd think.
I think that's her plan.
It's got to be the plan. But maybe Bol's looking at that and saying, well, in the next couple of years, it's a period off. Next year's a really good year to make a change, because we've said this before, there is no global championship. I know they've got that season-ending thing and so on, but that doesn't carry the same prestige as either an Olympics or a world title. So it's a perfect opportunity. So I reckon it's probably been brewing in her mind and the mind of her coach for some time. They would be doing a lot of training sessions that would give you a good indication of what's possible over 800. And I think they've probably said there's not much to lose here, because you're dominant enough at the hurdles that you can just go back to it if you need to. So let's give it a crack at 800, because it is a new challenge and it's possibly a way to expand your, to use a cliche from cycling, palmares a little bit. Imagine she succeeds, then you've got an athlete who's a record holder 400 flat for her country, admittedly indoors and infrequently, but a dominant bar one over the hurdles, who then transitions to an 800. I think it's a cool opportunity.
I think it's a prestige thing as well, because the 800 has got it's far more exposure, perhaps with sponsors. I don't think money drives this, to be honest with you, but hurdling is perhaps not second rate, but it's down the list of people's choices to watch, isn't it?
Sometimes I saw that there was a bit of discussion, you and some of our listeners over on Discourse. Like, the exception is in the build up to Tokyo, we had Varholm Benjamin, and ever since that's their presence in that event, the 400 meter hurdles for men, has made the 400 hurdles probably one of the top 3 events at every major championships.
I disagree. I think people would always choose to watch the 400 over the 400 hurdles. And same as the 100 over the 100-meter hurdles.
I think when Benjamin, Warholm and De Santos are in the 400 hurdles, you'd pick it over the current crop of 400-meter athletes. I think it's probably true if you say, let's look at the era when Michael Johnson was racing. But I mean, who name the 6 medalists in the last 2 major championships over 400 flat? Like, almost anonymous.
Say that, yeah.
So I think at the moment, if you gave me the choice, I'd rather watch the 400 hurdles for men.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in general, I take your point. I think I see your point. And the other thing is, someone like Bol, she runs. She clearly loves to race, because every time there's a world relays or there's a major championships, she's in the mixed, she's in the 4x4 women, she's in her own individual event. She quite enjoys it, which endears her to me. I like that more than I like seeing someone 4 or 5 times every year. No names mentioned, right? And maybe the 800 is appealing to Bol because it's literally a race. It's you in amongst other people. And I think she probably enjoys that challenge.
So that challenge is the perfect way to look at it, because the challenges she faces, she's got a physiological challenge of moving up the distance and also a tactical challenge. Which one do you think she's going to find harder to deal with?
Again, I saw some discourse people talking about the 800 meter and the tactics, and of course there'll be a bit of jostling. I don't think it's going to be that big an issue for her, because she's accustomed to running 400 relays where you sort of do that. I know it's different. It's open by the time she gets the baton and usually running the anchor leg. I think the physiological challenge is a bigger one to overcome than the tactical, purely because you can learn the tactical within 3 or 4 races.
Do you think that it would be that quick? Because
tactically,
a bit of experience, because it's not just learning about jostling and being in with the pack. It's you can have different people running different races, different paces, knowing whether to go or not.
Yeah, but that's why 2026 is such a good year to do this, because she can pick half a dozen 800s on the European circuit where the pace is planned. And so she doesn't have to worry about finding herself jogging a 32-second first 200 in a major championship, getting potentially boxed in. They can just set it up with a pace setter and say the pace setter is running to 400 meters in 56, and Femke needs to be on the shoulder. And if Wero or Hodgkinson, whoever is there, then I don't know. I think these 800 races on the circuit are fast enough that there's not that much tactical nuance. In a major championship, there may be another story, because then you'll see, like was even maybe done to Hodgkinson in Tokyo, where the Kenyans run together and you don't know what's going to happen. There's no designated pace setter. So that'll be an interesting challenge for her to see. But I think she can control the tactics by selecting the races appropriately next year.
Mm-hmm. So she's going to be running obviously an extra lap, going from 4 to 800 meters. Physiologically, what's she going to have to do in training to prepare for this? What?
Yeah, so they're interesting because the rarity of a 4.8 runner indicates to you that it's a physiologically significant challenge to switch from one to the next. Otherwise, you'd see it all the time. It would be like 800, 1500, 5,000, 10,000, even 15.5 these days, which is an interesting phenomenon. That didn't used to happen as much as it does now. The Ingebrigtsen and Kipyegon, Segai types. So physiologically, obviously, the endurance requirement to run an 800 is significantly greater. That said, they are both fatigue tolerance tests in the sense that you run them at a speed where you are accepting a degree of fatigue, and the challenge is to tolerate that in order to slow down as little as possible over the course of the distance. 800-meter runners don't really speed up. I suppose at a micro level, if you analyze 50-meter increments, you can have some shifts, but they're fatigue tolerance tests. There's a significant strength and power component to the 400, which diminishes quite a lot as you move to 800. But the main difference is that the aerobic foundation, by which we mean oxygen dependent, in running an 800 is so much larger than in running a 400. And so the training requirement shift will be interesting for Bol, because it would need a significant larger proportion rather of her time to be spent on doing what, for want of a better word, would be called aerobic or endurance base work. And that's really important, because she will clearly be the fastest athlete on the start line over 400 meters. I mean, Hodgkinson and some of the others, Mora's a good 400 meter runner, But Bol is another level. Like we're talking sub 49 second caliber. No one else has got that. And I remember a very accomplished coach who coached Wulaudzi to silver in World Championships and a few other Olympic 800 meter runners said to me, the key thing in an 800 is you have to have what he called preservation time. If your 400 meter best was slow enough that the halfway split in an 800 was close to that, what were you going to do on the second lap? In other words, if your 400 meter best was, say, 46 seconds and they run 49 through the bell, you are only within 5% of your best. If your 400 best is 44.5, now you've got a bigger preservation time. And so now you can use, but obviously that doesn't work. Otherwise, Michael Johnson would have been the 800 meter world record holder too, right? So it doesn't work perfectly. But the point he's making is that speed counts for a great deal. If, and only if, you have the aerobic conditioning base to use that speed in the last 200 meters when you are fatigued.
Do you think that other people, the other runners, are going to change their tactics to sort of deal with Bol, or it doesn't work that way?
I think everyone, again, it depends, right? Because
she's going to want a slow first lap, isn't she? And then,
yeah, she would be very happy if the first lap was slow. So if we forecast ahead, let's say next season goes well for Bol, and she runs a 156, 157. She'd be very happy with that, I would imagine. By 2027, going to the World Championships, she'd be thinking, if we can go through the bell here in 58, 59, I can peel off another one of those off that. And so traditionally, tactically, you'd be thinking, we got to run a 55 first lap for a Hodgkinson to take advantage of the 800 meter strength that she has. But by next year this time, we may have seen that Bol has more of that than everyone else too.
Yeah, we just don't know.
And I mean, in some of the interviews that came out after the announcement, her coach has said, and they would have done a lot of sessions like this. A 400 meter hurdles athlete is doing a lot of 600 meter type time trialing and training. They'll know what she's capable of over 600 meters, and it's very close to what Hodgkinson's producing.
Yeah, they wouldn't have gone for it otherwise.
Exactly. So they'll have got sessions that forecast an 800 meter, and they'll know that they're not trying to transform an athlete into an 800. They're trying to tweak an athlete into an 800 meter athlete, and I reckon she'll be pretty close. Now, others have tried it and not succeeded. There was a really good article that Chris Chavez did for Citius Mag. I'll put a link in the show notes, in which he explained a few previous or precedents for this. And it has happened with mixed success. But there's just something about the way Bol runs a 400, and even in those relay races, you could see. I think her transition to 800 is going to be smoother than for most.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I messaged you when we heard the news, I was like, that's the world record going one way or another.
You'd think so. What's Bol going to do? Like I said, I think next year if Bol can run 156 something. You know, her PB is 219, which is rubbish, but it's like admittedly 8 years old. So she obviously hasn't given it a go in 8 years.
But it's all about the Olympics, isn't it? This is a 3-year plan.
Yeah, exactly. It's
World Championships and Olympics.
It's 2026 to test the waters, maybe mess it up, practice. Like expectations can be low because there's no major championship. If she runs 159 next year, I don't think she'll be unhappy.
Did you see there's somebody else testing the waters as well? Paulino.
Yeah, I saw that.
Marodi Paulino has announced that she's just going to have a little bit of a play around in the 800, I think, next year. He said she's just going to give it a go. So, and she's obviously a 400 meter runner going straight up. Perhaps she doesn't want Sydney in the 400, although it was pretty close in Tokyo.
Yeah, I was surprised by that one.
Is it a new trend? All these athletes swapping it around and.
I don't know. No, I don't think it'll become anything. It's just
perhaps Michael Johnson kicked it off with his Grand Slam track. All these different disciplines.
I'm surprised. I thought Paulinho would do it the other way and go and run more 200s. But I was surprised by that. But anyway, so for Bol, the season structure changes. She's going to spend probably a little bit more time doing an altitude camp that she wouldn't have done. The strength
Why altitude camp?
Because you can accelerate the aerobic and oxidative development in that way. So instead of going and doing explosive speed and power-based type training, she'll have to do a significant portion of her year will now be dedicated to handling what's basically increased mileage. the gym training changes slightly. I've seen some clips of her doing plyometric and power-based stuff. It's incredibly impressive. And she'll obviously keep some of that going, but it also changes focus a little bit more. Because the volume load goes up now, and the speed load has to come down a little bit to compensate or to allow for that. So there'll be some interesting training adjustments. But I'm overall, I don't think it has to change drastically, because the hurdles component of a 400 probably adds a little bit more that makes that transition to 800 easier.
Mm-hmm. Must be quite exciting for it. It must keep the fire burning in an athlete to get a new challenge like this.
That's I mean, not reading between the lines, in her own words, I think that challenge is part of what's driving that, yeah. Mm-hmm. It must be really interesting, because again, they'll know. They've done a 600 where they've run a 600 in 122 or whatever it is. You take your 123, 122, and they said, you know what, like we can turn this into a world-class 800. This is going to be fun.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So last weekend we had the Chicago Marathon, and at halfway you got really excited because you thought the world record. No, you didn't really think the world record was on in any way, shape, or form, did you? Because it was run by Jacob Kiplimo of Uganda, and halfway he ran the first half in 1 hour and 16 seconds, which obviously would put him on for world record pace. But he ended up finishing in 2:02 with 23 seconds, which is still one hell of a run. It's not far outside the world record. What is it, about 30 seconds outside?
No, the world record's 2 hours 35 seconds. It's almost 2 minutes out.
Yeah. 90 seconds outside or so. Which you counted as a failure and I counted as a success, because I think if you can run 2:02.23 in Chicago, you're still absolutely at the top of your game.
You are.
So we came to a disagreement on this one, didn't we?
But to be fair to me, it's a very specific type of failure within the context of an overall success. Mm-hmm. That for diplomacy.
I looked at this because Stephen Sawyer, he ran in Berlin.
Sebastian.
And he went through Sebastian Sauer. He went through half in Berlin in exactly the same time, 1 hour and 16 seconds. And they both, and he ended up finishing in 2 hours, 2 minutes and 16 seconds. So they're virtually running identical races here within 7 seconds of each other, but both failing to come close to that world record in the end.
Yeah.
So is this pacing? Is it physiology? What's going on?
Well, those are the same thing. Pacing is physiology. That's the theme of this podcast today, as I said at the top. But it was such an interesting weekend for this. Well, this race was one reason it was an interesting weekend, because watching it, they went to halfway in 1 hour 16 seconds, as you noted. But that's not the whole story. Like, there's a granularity here that I think tells the actual story. Because remember that to run a world record, you have to average 14 minutes and 17 seconds per 5Ks, right? So that's your reference point, 14:17. Anything faster than that means you're under world record pace. Anything slower than that obviously means you're outside it. The first 5K in Chicago was reached in 13:58. So they were... lots of maths there. 19 seconds for that 5K split too fast. Call it 4 seconds per kilometer. And the thing about physiology, especially in the marathon, it's different in our next conversation about the Ironman, but in the marathon, the way that these guys are now racing this event, they are basically running just a couple of % below their threshold pace for the entire distance of the marathon. So, you know, like in cycling, we talk about critical power. In running, the equivalent is critical velocity. These guys are running half marathons, almost by definition, which is your 1 hour sustainable speed, at that speed, at that pace. So that's 250 or whatever it is a kilometer these days. The moment you drift slightly faster than that, you've gone above threshold. And when you go above threshold, you're basically taking out the physiological equivalent of a loan.
So you're saying that they took out a loan in the first 5K?
Yeah. So when you see a 13:58, even if it's slightly downhill, a little bit I think there were some context circumstances, but you look at that and say, crisis, that's a little bit fast. Like that better settle down really quickly, or this race is going to go south for these guys, because that pace is almost exactly on their 1 hour sustainable pace. And the race is 2 hours, not one. So something has to give. And sure enough, it did, because the next 5K split was 14:27. So, okay, they've slowed it down. They've settled back. They're now averaging the right pace. Let's see what happens from here. Then they go 14:16, 14:25. So to halfway, they're pretty good. The biggest problem in this race was that just as they reached halfway, John Correa threw in a surge. Were you watching it at this stage, or did you check it later?
No, you'd only just reminded me that it was on.
Yeah. So John Correa is the defending champion. He was mega hyped leading up to this race. They were the ones talking about going at world record pace. And the moment the pace setter dropped out, Correa surged. I don't know what he was thinking, because they were already 14 seconds faster to halfway than they'd anticipated or planned, because it was supposed to be 60 minutes and 30 seconds. But when Correa surges in that race just after halfway, they run the next, call it 4 kilometers, at 2:51 pace, which is a crazy fast. In fact, his surge for those 4Ks was 2:48, which is a 14-minute 5K tempo. So now, from the start line to 5Ks, they've gone too quick. And then from halfway to 25Ks, they've again gone too quickly. That's two mistakes too many. Maybe you can get away with one. But when you make the same mistake twice in both halves of a marathon, you're going to pay. And so watching it, I'm thinking, oh man, the bills are going to come. The bill is going to post, and it's going to arrive at some point. And it didn't arrive quickly, because Kiplimo kept going, and he kept ticking off these really quick Ks. He does 14:06 to 25, 14:19, 14:22, and you're thinking he could actually hang on to this, because all the way to 35K, he was still on marathon world record pace. And then from 35 to 40, he cracks, and he runs 15 minutes, 17 seconds. And all of a sudden, that world record is now a minute off. And then the last 2.2 kilometers, he runs at 3:17 a K pace, which is 16:26 for 5Ks, tempo, basically. And so you can see, like, the physiological wheels actually fell off, because that first 5K and that 4K segment from halfway to 25 are just physiological loans. And when the check arrives, the interest repayments kill you.
Did the wheels fall off, or did he just slow down because he'd already won the race, I wonder?
No, he was going for that world record. I think he really wanted to. And he was hurting in the last 5 or 6 Ks. So I think he slowed down dramatically. But it held it together surprisingly well, because the guy who threw the attack in, John Correa, didn't make the 35K mark. He bailed from the race. So for him, the bill was... Yeah. So it was a fascinating insight into how precise pacing has to be, because these guys are running it at like 90 to 94% of their critical power, or critical velocity, if you wish. And if you drift slightly above that lactate threshold, whatever you want to call it, the costs start to be incurred, and you cannot escape them. They might be delayed, but they're going to arrive.
That's what I was going to say. As a marathon Luddite, does it really make that much difference if you run a 13:58 or a 14:12?
That's what's crazy.
14 seconds. Does it really matter? To the people who aren't marathon runners out there listening now, they'll probably be thinking the same as me. It's 14 seconds. Well, in 14 seconds, you can put your shoes on.
And it doesn't matter to them, but to these guys, because they are so close to running the whole distance at threshold. And remember threshold, it's an exponential curve, right? Like the moment you cross the threshold, things happen exponentially. So fatigue isn't just like, I might just get a couple percent more. That 1% increase in pace incurs a 6% increase in cost, because of the nature of a threshold, the exponential nature of this particular threshold.
But these margins are so fine then. So the next iteration of super shoes, or the next fueling paradigm, is going to push us over the edge towards the world record or the 2-hour marathon. It's got to, if it's this close.
Yeah, it could actually, and that's what the carbon shoe did, because it lowered depending on your perspective on this, let's talk about it like this: it lifted the threshold, so that guys could now go faster before they crossed that point at which things start to go wrong exponentially quickly. And again, to your point, if you're running a 3.5 hour, 4-hour marathon, like most people listening to this, the typical human, 10 seconds a K doesn't matter to you. But when you're trying to run a 2:01 marathon, and you're so close to what is essentially your critical velocity. That's your peak sustainable, and you drift slightly above that, physiology will get you because they are that close to the threshold.
Yeah, I was looking at Sebastian Sawe in London, and he runs virtually an identical time yet again at 2:02:27. But this time he goes through half at 1:01:30, so over a minute slower at halfway. But exactly the same thing happens, and he finishes with the same time. So even with perfect pacing, as you would think. In fact, he's run a negative split there, hasn't he?
Yeah, because if you look, I don't know if you've got all the 5K segments. Look at the one from, it's either 30 to 35 or 35 to 40. It's crazy fast.
He runs a 13:56.
Yeah, he just kills everyone. Like, that's where he wins the race. So what's happened in London is Sawe has decided, I'm racing this. The world record is not on today. We'll go through halfway in 61 something. What was it? 61?
61:30.
Yeah, and so that's a 2:03 pace, and then I'm going to whack you guys with a 5K segment no one can match.
Either way, it doesn't end up in a world record. It's weird.
But what happened to Sawe in Berlin is he was just done by the heat. And so I reckon, so it's really interesting because now there are two men who I think are viable sub-201 athletes.
Yeah.
Sub-world record is another story. It's another 25 seconds, and you think, hey, what's 25 seconds over a marathon? But it's not, it's as we've discovered, like 2 seconds a K could be the difference. But Sawe and Kiplimo both have the potential to break that world record. And if that happens, then you've got to start thinking sub-2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think we'll see it in my lifetime.
Oh, I think we'll see it by Los Angeles.
We've said that before.
I think next year the world record could go, and the year after that in 27 or in 28 if the conditions, because this is obviously the key. I reckon Sawe could break that world record now in favourable conditions. I think he's slightly better than Kiplimo. But I think Kiplimo is a sub-201 guy without those 2 5K, call them pacing mistakes.
What's interesting, I was looking at the progression of the world record, and it's always been Berlin where it's been set and lowered. Until recently, Chicago seems to be on par with it.
Yeah, it is. It was always Berlin, and I don't know whether that was a
conditions, perhaps.
Certainly, Chicago has been undone in the past by either very hot or very cold conditions, and the last sort of 10 to 15K of Chicago can be quite windy. I forget exactly what the route is, but the section of it like is exposed to the lake, and you come along there and you get blasted by headwinds. So I think that's probably cost Chicago a couple of times. Yeah,
because of course Keppengetich, that was Chicago, wasn't it, when she smashed the world record, which still stands much as it sticks in my throat.
Yeah, and not the previous one, but the one before that was also Chicago for the women, I think. I don't know if you've got those in front of you.
No.
The one that was set coincidentally the day after Kipchoge broke 2 hours in the second of the gimmicks, but was also Chicago women's record. So Berlin seems good. I think Valencia is another super fast one. I think that's where the fastest debuts have been happening. Guys go there, maybe a little bit less pressure. But I reckon, and the other thing about Chicago, by the way, is the 90-degree corners, which is the
Does
same.
That cost that much?
When you're running 21k an hour, like if every corner costs you 1 second and there's 10 of them per well, not 10, let's call it 20 of them in Chicago and only 5 in Berlin, there's something there.
How do they measure the course length on a marathon? Is it the fastest way around the corners, like the apex, if you were taking them on a bike? Or
yeah, and then in between the corners it's supposedly the tangents where available. Is there used to be a blue line that showed you the shortest distance around, but maybe the cities have said we don't want a blue paint line on our marathon, on our tarred roads, I don't know. But there used to be a line that actually showed the 42.195 distance.
Interesting.
Okay. London's the other one, of course, but London also, it's windy along the Thames over the final 10, 15k, and it's got too many sharp corners, a couple of U-turns, a couple of cobbled sections. And we're getting to the point where those things add up, you know? So it's...
Is that why Valencia's considered a quick course?
I think so, yeah. And the conditions.
Okay. Speaking of conditions and courses, and pacing errors, we'll move on to Kona. and the Ironman at the weekend, because it was an absolutely spectacular race in the women's event, because we saw the two leaders both cracking in the marathon at the end. And it was unprecedented scenes, I would say. And I've got to say thank you to Rob and Ali over on Discourse. Rob, who's alerted us to this race, and then Ali, who's provided some excellent insights on it. So Taylor Knibb and Lucy Charles-Barclay, they were the hot favourites, and Charles-Barclay came out of the water quickest, as I think she usually does. And then we had some back and forth in the cycling, and we'll get into the details a little bit later. I'll just lay the background now. But they still had, I think, 14 minutes on everybody else as they started the run. But it didn't turn out that they ended up 1 and 2. In fact, they didn't come anywhere at all, because both runners blew up in the marathon, as I said earlier. Charles-Barclay blew up, I think, after about 10k. She was seen shoveling ice down her top, and then her husband, I think, basically pulled the plug on the whole thing because she was staggering around. And then I think about 4 or 5k from the line, Taylor Knibb, with the race at hand, sat down because she could go no further. She was weaving about as well. And so the first thing, obviously, that we all thought was that the heat had got to them. But when we looked into it, it wasn't actually as hot as we thought, was it?
No, it wasn't. And I mean, we looked at the temperatures, and I think they were in the high 20s, which is certainly by no means what you'd consider limiting. And also some of the other performances on the day, and we'll get to those when we talk about the eventual podium, were impressive enough that you know that if an athlete was prepared for those conditions, and I guess I'm giving the game away, manages their efforts in those conditions, they could get by without a limitation.
So if it wasn't the heat, then it's got to be the pacing that went wrong, right?
Yeah, and those two things are not necessarily independent of one another. That's the key here, right? It's not like it's either heat or a pacing error. It's the pacing in the context of the conditions, because 28 is still not ideal. We spoke a few minutes ago about Sebastian Sarwe in Berlin, and now his world record attempt was undone by the heat. It was way cooler than 28, but it's still too hot to run a 2-hour marathon. So we have to bear in mind that it's not ideal conditions, but not brutally hot like we've seen some marathons that have caused similar scenes to the heat strokes. Remember Callum Hawkins, was it, in Brisbane? Gabrielle Anderson in 1984 in the Los Angeles Olympics was a very famous one. So the scenes that you described a few minutes ago are heat-related scenes, but I think the way that Knibb and Charles-Barclay paced themselves pushed them into heat trouble that they could have avoided had they managed the physiology through the bike and the run a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. I think it was probably the bike that did for them, because thanks to Ali, as I said earlier, for these notes, because he said Taylor Knibb put in a monster surge on the climb to the turn point, and she closed a 2-minute gap to Barclay in a single 5k split. So obviously she's well into the red doing that. And after collecting her food bag, she surged again to catch Barclay up and made a pass, followed by what appeared to be a sustained effort to try and get clear. Barclay reacted to stay in contact, and both athletes were visibly working very hard. Barclay then incurred a 1-minute penalty for littering. How do you manage to do littering? Just you're not allowed to. You only drop things off at a food point, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a zone, a demarked zone, and if you happen to drop your gel pack or whatever it is outside of that, you get the penalty.
Ouch. So, and then she made her own pass in anticipation of serving this, and another sustained effort, which then Knibb reacted to. And then after she stopped for a penalty, Knibb forced the pace, presumably to make sure there was little chance of her coming back during the bike leg. So it's surging one after another, one after another, one after another. And of course, you can't draft, can you, in Ironman? So to make a pass, you've got to be going a hell of a pace to get past. You can only get one go at it, don't you?
Yeah, and I mean, that stat we got on Discourse from my listeners there, like two-minute gap opened or closed in a 5K segment. And admittedly, it's a climb, so it's not 5Ks in 8 minutes. It might be 5K in 11, 12 minutes, but that's 2 minutes faster over that period. You know you're going way higher. The wattage for that period is super high. And if they kept taking surges to try and open gaps, close gaps, you know that the power profile is going to be all over the place. And you know, like it's Meanwhile, in third, fourth, fifth, everyone is managing their efforts with as constant an effort as possible. And so we've spoken before about load management, like when we discussed how you measure training load, is if your average power output and your normalized power, which is remember that's a mathematical formula that sort of accounts for how much time you spend at high intensities and so on. If those are relatively similar, then it's an even effort. I would imagine that Knibb and Charles-Barclay are way higher in terms of normalized because they're throwing in all these surges. And the problem is, just like Kiplimo and Correa in particular discovered in Chicago on the Sunday, those surges come at a physiological cost. And in the case of Kona, for those two athletes, that cost is heat storage, because every time you go a little bit harder, your power is watts, it's joules, that's the same unit. So that's driving temperature up, it's heat production. And you can't lose that heat effectively enough when it's 28 degrees Celsius. It's not 40, and it's not like Tokyo or Budapest humidity levels, but it's still hot and humid enough that when you incur that heat production cost, you can't get rid of it. And so they're driving their body temperatures up and up and up and up. And then when you get off the bike, now the wind cooling goes right down, because you're not going 40-something K an hour, you're going 13, 14 K an hour, and all of a sudden, or 15 in their case, and all of a sudden, heat storage goes up even more.
Mm. Ali says, it got strangely when Charles-Barclay ran out at a 2:48 marathon pace. And he says that she's got no pedigree for that. And it probably wasn't necessary unless the others were really capable of going like a 2:35, running a 2:35 marathon, or that Knibb herself had dramatically improved her running. So it looks like a pacing error even on the run then from Lucy Charles-Barclay. And it sounds almost as if these two athletes, Knibb and Charles-Barclay, basically raced each other to destruction in the end.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's pacing. And I mean, it's easy for us to talk about, and I know this, like I used to, because I did my PhD on pacing for the sake of disclosure, and we always used to talk about how athletes pace themselves. But you put them in a race situation against a rival, and it becomes a much more complex situation than simply listen to your body and let your brain control the pace. And the two athletes are looking at each other, they're saying, I need to open a gap. Someone's trying to open a gap, I need to respond and then counterattack. And they're basically taking chunks out of each other physiologically. They're pushing each other to make what will turn out to be pacing mistakes. Now, for Charles-Barclay, that pacing mistake manifests itself eventually at, 28, just over 28 Ks was when her husband says that's enough.
I thought it was a bit earlier than that. Was it 28 Ks?
I think it was around there. I mean, obviously she'd run herself into trouble before that, but I saw a graphic illustrating
She was walking in the aid stations, wasn't she, before that?
Yeah,
I think that's where she started struggling.
And so the final point of, let's call it, again, it's a very specific kind of physiological failure, is 28K, but it was preceded by all these minutes before it. Whereas Knibb makes it to within 3K or so of the finish, I think it was, right?
4K, I think, of the finish. And then just literally sits down.
Yeah, and that's what happens with these situations. Like, it's so interesting. There have been some studies in lab conditions, again, where they somehow make people exercise till they get to 40 degrees, just over body temperature. Now, quick physiology. As we're sitting here, as you're listening to this, assuming you're not exercising, you may well be, your body temperature is 36.5 to 37.5 degrees Celsius. When you exercise, your body allows it to go up, 38, 39, even 39.5 is normal for exercise. But when you start getting above 40, things can start to go wrong for you. And studies have found, and this is true in humans and other animals, that when you get to 40, 41 degrees Celsius body temperature, your brain function is impaired. That's why people get confused. They don't recognize family members. I heard, because I was told about this by a friend of mine, Ralph Mitchell, also a pod listener, Medals and Medicine on Instagram, if you want to give him a follow, that Charles-Barclay's husband said she didn't recognize me at some point. And that was a feature of a lot of the heat strokes that we've seen in these competitions. They can't walk in a straight line because their motor cortex of the brain is overheated and recruiting muscle has gone haywire. So you can't coordinate your muscle contractions. So it's a proper failure of physiology by the time you get to the point that those two athletes were. And Knibb eventually just concedes that physiology's got her and she sits down.
Mm. But they're so driven, these athletes, because you could see Charles-Barclay was desperately trying to cool herself down with ice. She vaguely knew what she was doing, but her instinct was just to keep racing. It's
Yeah, and over on Discourse, one of our listeners gave us splits, not nice, convenient 5K splits, but if you look at the paces that he very kindly calculated, Charles-Barclay doesn't slow down from the 4 minutes a K pace that she would have. Well, she started a little bit faster, right? She was, as with Ali, he said 2:48 marathon pace, so that's 4 minutes a K. They ran the first segments faster than that. There were some segments at like 3:40s, 3:50s. Am I right? Do I have that correct?
Yeah.
But even in that period where Charles-Barclay was clearly heading into trouble, her slowest pace is only like 4:10, 4:12 a K. So she's holding on to what she thinks is the required race pace right up to the very point at which she can't even continue. To your point about how driven they are.
We haven't even mentioned the winner. The winner was Solveig Lothes of Norway, and Britain's Kat Matthews came second by only 35 seconds. And they paced it probably perfectly, because even though Kat Matthews said she mentioned losing more time than expected while sticking to her numbers on the bike. And then she ran a 2:47 marathon, and that's a course record for the women. So it goes to show that if it was perfectly possible in those conditions to run a very fast marathon, but the two out front had just blown themselves up.
Exactly, and Matthews was patient and, in her own words, managed her bike leg exactly according to a plan and allowed a gap to develop, which is really interesting. So she was disciplined enough to say, they can do what they want to do out front. I've got a plan and I'm going to stick with it. And you've got to say in the end, she's not the winner, but she's a winner on the day. And the other one is the Norwegian, because the bike leg, Knibb and Charles-Barclay do a 4:31 bike leg, and so does, remind me of the surname, Lovseth. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
So they do the same bike leg, and this is an interesting point to what we were discussing earlier on, is Lovseth's pacing to do a 4:31 was probably really even. Never surging, never slacking off. Whereas the two in the front, I think they were taking shots at one another in the aggressive racing style that they raced, and it cost them for the same performance, which is really interesting. They probably could have gone faster on the bike with less physiological cost.
Yeah, it was absolutely fascinating to watch as I went back and actually looked at the highlights. It's just like you say, it's a perfect example of pacing gone wrong.
Yeah, and was acknowledged by Taylor Knibb the next day. There was a press conference for athletes in which she speaks about it, and there was a little bit before this talking about what she saw. She saw Charles-Barclay and so on, but I did want to play in the last part of what she had to say. I hope I've queued it up correctly for you, but this is what she has to say, and it sort of relates back to how they abandoned the plan to just race one another, and then a bit at the end, I gotta call her out, this cannot be true.
At a certain point, you just stop looking at your watch and just like, you gotta race it. And I thought, like, and that's probably the danger, like, and that's where I really respect Lucy, because like she's a racer, and I love to race too. And that's when you put two of them together, it might not be great. Sometimes there'll be good times, sometimes it'll be like yesterday, but I wouldn't change a thing.
So that's Taylor Knibb, and I understand the sentiment of not changing a thing, but come on, you would change one thing. Let's be honest. You'd change
your placing.
You'd change the last 3
sure.
Ks. Let's be frank here. Like, and if you genuinely think you wouldn't change a thing, well, then you're not learning.
Mm. Do you? I'll throw another little plot twist in that they both have the same coach, Dan Laurent.
Yeah, and actually, I didn't play that part in. She makes a pretty good joke. The saying that of anyone who had a bad day on the day of the race, he was the one, because he saw both his athletes lose the lead to abandons.
How does that work? Coaching two athletes who are in competition like that.
Oh, but you know what was especially interesting about it, and again, she said it, and I'll put the clip for you to hear the whole thing. She says that they got the same coach, and so they were getting similar sessions, but never did them together. So they don't know each other at all, other than the fact that they're being coached the same way.
But it's not the actual coaching I'm talking about. It's the race tactics, because you're going to get your race tactics partially from your coach, aren't you? and he knows what the other one's doing. He can't pretend that he doesn't know. So
Yeah.
it's an odd one, that.
Yeah, but it was a tremendous race, and sometimes you see these like really managed race to the numbers, and then other times you see situations like this. And I know you like it, and I can't say I don't enjoy it, but I will say if you want to come back and win that race, you got to find a compromise where at some point someone's going to attack you, and you just got to say, you know what, good luck. I'll see you 10K later.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we'll continue the themes because we're going to talk a little bit about fatigue now and fueling, because perhaps they got their fueling wrong. You never know. But that's speculation I'm throwing out there.
Speaking of, Love31 posted something saying 130 grams an hour of carbs to win that race, by the way. Just putting it out there.
Oh, that's interesting, because apparently you can get by on 10 carbs an hour. According to an upcoming paper that I spotted this morning, Tim Noakes posted a link to a paper that he will be publishing in the upcoming months. This is sort of like a summary beforehand, called Rethinking Carbs and Fatigue. So as a brief explainer, he says at the moment the thinking is obviously if you want to go harder, you've got to load up on carbohydrates. But he says, what if that entire story, the one that has literally fueled generations of athletes, is built on a huge misunderstanding of what really makes us tired? He says, for the last half century, pretty much all of sports science has been completely obsessed with muscles. Like the gas tank theory, he calls it. It's simple, it's intuitive, and honesty. It's just filling up your muscles with carbs. The idea is your muscles have a limited tank of carbs, which is called glycogen. When that tank hits empty, you hit the wall. Simple as that. Your workout is over, and that makes perfect sense, he says. So papers of there was a paper, I think it was quite early, and you probably know this study well, in 1967. Is that one?
I know of it. I don't know it well,
Okay.
but I know of it. Yeah, I know which ones he's referring to.
Okay, he's saying that this study, it shows that there was a big, like a 70% difference between the groups of the muscle glycogen levels as these athletes hit the wall. And he said, if an empty muscle tank was the real culprit when hitting the wall, you'd expect everybody to be bottomed out. But if you look at the blood glucose, the levels were incredibly similar, different by only 20%. He says, and here's the kicker, they were all low. This strongly suggests that the real common denominator wasn't an empty tank in the muscle, but a low fuel line going to the brain. He says, fatigue is actually the brain sensing a dangerous dip in your blood sugar and stepping in and putting the brakes on. So this is an interesting theory, but it's going completely against the current thinking, as you just mentioned, of athletes taking high amounts of carbs. And I mentioned 10 grams of carbs earlier on, because he actually says one study found that as little as 10 grams of carbs per hour, that's less than half a single energy gel, was enough to prevent low blood sugar and boost performance by a massive 12 to 20%.
Yeah.
What do you make of this?
Yeah, it's frustrating to read because Tim has, in the last decade, I left sports science. Tim supervised my PhD, incidentally. So a lot of that stuff that I was talking about a few minutes back about fatigue and regulation and heat storage and so on was inspired by his work on what he called the central governor theory. By the time I was writing my PhD up, decided to change the name and rather talk about a model for anticipatory regulation, because the central governor theory had become so divisive and for some people so offensive because Tim has a tendency to offend people who disagree with him. And so I remember going to conferences and people were like laughing at the central governor idea. That's how it was received, which is crazy because it's such a logical and elegant model. But the label was, I think, what they were rejecting without reading behind the label. They read the label, they didn't open the box, as it were. But the basic premise is this, is that fatigue is a consequence of some physiological failure. That's what Tim called a catastrophic model. What he was saying, and what I ended up adding to a little bit, I suppose, in my PhD, is that fatigue is actually a sensation whose function is to prevent that catastrophic failure. So that catastrophic failure can take a few different forms. It can take the form of two triathletes reaching the ultimate limit of their physiology in Kona on a Saturday afternoon and stopping the race with a win in sight. Now, in their case, the physiological failure we think is body temperature, heat storage, which heat accumulates, and eventually you get to a critical hyperthermia temperature, and we say, done. The brain is like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I'm failing. It could be, as you mentioned, in the same context, running out of fuel. And those studies Tim was talking about there are decades-old studies where when humans developed the ability to do muscle biopsies, they got obviously real excited because now we could measure what's happening in the muscle, we could measure what's happening in the liver. And they did that, and they measured that you've got carbohydrate stores in liver and in muscle, and if either of those is depleted, you're going to fail. So we need fuel in order to power work, right? So I'm giving you context here, but does it all make sense so far?
Yep.
Now, what Tim is saying at the end there, and this is absolutely true, it's logical, shouldn't be anyone disagree with, is that running out of fuel or reaching a critical body temperature at the 25k mark of a marathon or 2/3 of the way up Hartekam in the Tour de France is a problem. You don't want that to happen. And what the brain is doing is it's slowing you down in advance of that. And that's where this idea of anticipatory regulation comes in, is that the brain knows where the end point is, and it anticipates the future consequences of my present behaviors. If I keep going at 400 watts, if I keep running at 2 minutes 52 seconds a K like Kiplimo, if I keep running at 350 like Charles-Barclay and Nnibb were trying to do, I will run myself into trouble. Therefore, I'm going to fatigue in order to slow down. Therefore, my fatigue sensation is going to become so large that it forces me to slow down. You felt that, right?
Mm-hmm. So is he saying that fatigue is all in the mind?
Tim sometimes does that, and this is where the central governor got, I think, a little bit extreme. Because he sometimes did. He would say things like fatigue is a sensation and it has no physiological basis. Well, hang on a moment. The sensation of fatigue, and you can quantify that out of 10 if you want. There's different ways. The sensation of fatigue is a manifestation of the physiological systems that it's monitoring. So your brain is monitoring temperature, oxygen availability, fuel availability, sodium osmolality potentially is one of those, mechanical receptors in the muscles and in the nerves. It's monitoring dozens of these physiological systems and then generating a sensation that is associated with them. Now, give you a couple of examples. If you go out and run and it's a particularly hot day, you slow down in the first few minutes of exercise. You haven't gotten hot yet, but you've made a decision to slow down. It's the same if you go and exercise without eating anything for 15 hours and you are liver and muscle glycogen depleted. Your gas tanks, as it were, have got very low levels of fuel. You will run slower in the first few minutes of exercise. If I teleported you to 4,000 meters above sea level and said go for a run and you didn't know it, within 30 seconds of starting exercise, your brain would have said, something's wrong, we must slow down. And that's what I mean is that decision, and it's not a conscious decision necessarily, to run slower, to cycle slower, is made by the brain based on all the available physiological information that it has at its disposal. And what Tim is saying here is that in the specific context of glucose in the blood, thus available to the brain, our brain is going to slow us down when that drops too low. And therefore, all you need to do is keep it at some minimum level and your body will be fine. And that is a massive oversimplification that I think ignores so many other different physiological concepts and theories and realities.
Well, I'll read you the mechanism he actually talks about here, because I think it's the mechanism that's important. He says, your brain is a massive energy hog, and it runs almost exclusively on glucose. It absolutely cannot function without a steady supply. A serious drop in that supply, a condition called neuroglycopenia, is a life-threatening emergency. So your body is hardwired with some incredibly powerful, non-negotiable safety systems to make sure that never happens. And this is the core of the new hypothesis. Fatigue isn't a sign of muscular fatigue, it's a protective sensation, an emotion created by your brain.
Yeah,
So-
which is correct, but is not exclusively an emotion. It's a physiological manifestation of what's happening in all the different systems of the body, one of which is blood glucose, because it's the thing that affects the glucose supply to the brain. And that part's correct. If the brain didn't have access to that glucose, it would be a physiological catastrophe. And so fatigue exists to prevent us from reaching that catastrophic state.
Yeah. Park that a minute, because it doesn't make sense to me, because more carbs would be better. But park that bit, because
Correct.
he does go on to say about how it actually works in stages. He says, first, your blood glucose starts to dip just a little. Second, your brain's fuel center, the hypothalamus, this detects the potential threat. Third, it immediately responds by sending fewer electrical signals to your muscles, telling them to chill out. And fourth, you will perceive that as feeling tired. You slow down, which naturally reduces glucose use and keeps the brain safe. It sounds like a reasonable hypothesis
Yeah,
of
it
how
is.
it might work.
That
But
was my
why
PhD.
then?
That
I'll
was
go back to what I was going to say. Is why then wouldn't you want to take as many carbs as possible to keep your brain topped up?
exactly. It's a selective application of a good model to support, and I'll use the word advisedly, ideology. Tim's ideology is that you don't need carbs, and so he's selectively applying his own model to support that, but ignoring some of the other things that his model would actually support in the other direction. And I'll give you an example from heat story. My heat and body temperature regulation. My very first study as part of my PhD, we invited guys into what we had in Cape Town was this environmental chamber. You could get the temperature all the way down to 10 degrees Celsius and all the way up to 40 degrees. You could control the humidity, and you had a massive fan that could generate wind speeds up to 40 km an hour. An extremely unpleasant place to be when it was 40 degrees with 80% humidity and 40 km an hour winds. It was horrendous. Even worse, actually, after half an hour with no wind. Then you can imagine it was like a sauna. Mm-hmm. And basically, we invited decent, not world-class by any means, not even national class, but cyclists to come in and do these 20-kilometer time trials in hot and cold conditions. And we found exactly the same kind of thing that Tim's described there. Within the first 5 minutes in the heat, these cyclists had made a decision to slow down. They hadn't yet overheated. We were measuring body temperature, skin temperature, perceived exertion, heart rate, and there was no difference between these guys in the hot and the cold condition, except for the power output. And so in a cold condition, guy's going 300 watts. In the hot condition, he's going 260 watts within the first 5 minutes. And because of the lower power, the body temperature doesn't go up faster. So in other words, the power has achieved the homeostasis. Does that make sense? The body temperature regulation is a function of the power output. And what we did was we measured muscle activation. So you can measure the electrical signal from the brain to the muscles. And sure enough, that's lower in the hot condition. So your brain activated less muscle when it was hot than when it was cold, specifically to ensure that you didn't overheat too soon in the context of a 20K time trial. And the way that it does that, and this is where my PhD eventually ended up, is because the sensation of fatigue predicts the physiological consequence, and you therefore slow down in advance of it, because you would feel too tired if you didn't. Does that sort of make sense?
It does, yeah.
Now apply that to sugar, to carbohydrates. Your brain is monitoring energy supply in the body. It's monitoring glucose in the liver, glucose in the blood, glycogen in the liver, because that's where the glucose comes from, and glycogen in the muscle. The moment there is a perceived threat, and Tim used the word potential threat in that piece, I think. You read it.
Yes, the hypothalamus detects the potential threat. And this is of glucose dripping in the brain, though. You didn't mention the brain then. You said that the brain is monitoring the liver and the muscle.
Yes.
But the brain monitors, Tim is saying, the brain monitors itself.
Well, that's where the
safety valve.
That's where the sensor is. So think of an air conditioning unit. I'm sitting here. There's an air conditioner above my left shoulder. That unit works by having a setting and a sensor. And somewhere in this room, there's a sensor probably in the device. And if the temperature drops, the aircon. If the temperature goes up, the aircon kicks in some cold air. If the temperature drops, the aircon kicks in some warm air. So there's a sensor, and that sensor's in the brain. That's exactly right. Now, if the brain's monitoring that as a potential threat, why would you ever allow any drop to occur? Because you're suddenly telling the brain there's a threat on the horizon. And so to your point, the whole central governor anticipatory regulation, call it what you want, model would be optimized if the brain was absolutely assured and confident that there was no threat to energy supply. And that's what happens when you supply carbohydrates. If you deny carbs all the way down to 10 grams per hour, you are telling the brain that you're okay, but man, you are vulnerable. This is fragile. This is a fragile homeostasis. This is a balance that could go one way or the next. Why would you do that?
Yeah, that's what I don't get now, because he says the old goal was to fill the muscle gas tank to the brim. This is what Tim says. The new goal, it's simply to provide just enough fuel to keep the brain's own fuel gauge in the green, to keep it feeling safe and secure so it never feels the need to pull the emergency brake. So that doesn't make sense, because you're just better off having more. Surely.
Exactly. It's the same
Why
thing.
Why risk it?
And again, I hope my use of analogies isn't confusing this, or equivalences rather. But with body temperature regulation, the brain is monitoring heat storage and body temperature changes. And so on a hot day, you go out, skin temperature is high. Body temperature, the brain's smart. It works out that if the skin temperature is high, and if I'm not losing heat through sweat, my heat storage is going up at a rate that's not sustainable. And it's monitoring that really early on. With blood glucose and energy supply, it's doing the same thing, except it's monitoring how much glucose is available to it. And the moment that starts to look like it's under threat, the body's going to go, hang on a moment, you need to slow down. Why would you want an athlete to slow down in advance of a threat when you could take that threat away completely by simply providing more energy to the body? It doesn't make any sense at all. And actually, it's so funny because I want to put up a graph here, right? This is a graph now. Imagine, so those of you watching on YouTube, you'll see this, but I'm going to describe it to you. On the y-axis, you're looking at the rating of perceived exertion. 6 is as low as it goes, and 20 is the highest it can go. So 20 out of 20 is I'm failing, I'm done. This is the maximum I can go, I'm stopping, okay? And in this particular study, they had cyclists come in and ride for 3 hours at the same power output, either in a carb-depleted state, so in other words, they hadn't eaten anything and they came with low fuel levels, let's call it gas tanks were empty, or in the gray circles, high carb levels, that had a big carbohydrate meal. And on the left-hand side, you've got the perception of effort as a function of time. And sure enough, the low-carb cyclists, the perception of effort climbs really steeply. So every 20 minutes, it's going up by a unit. 1, 2, it's going up from 11 to 12 to 13 to 14 to 15. And eventually they reach fatigue after, let's call it, just under 2 hours. On the other hand, people who've got high carbohydrate levels before exercise have a much slower rate at which the rating of perceived exertion goes up. And that happens within the first 20 minutes of exercise. So somehow the brain is aware that it's got abundant energy supply, and the perception of effort is lower than when there is low energy supply. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the brain's monitoring the system. And if you gave it carbohydrates, you would exercise at the same intensity feeling better, lower perception of effort. And Tim is now arguing that you don't need to do that as long as you've got just enough for the brain to be just safe enough to allow you to keep exercising. It makes no sense at all. And by the way, this graph that I've been describing is from a paper that Tim wrote in 2004. He knows this. This model of the brain forecasting the future consequences of exercise is something that he developed himself. And he's now ignoring part of it in order to argue against carbohydrates.
Interesting. So why do you think he's coming up with this theory now? It's like an old versus new thing, isn't it? It's
and Tim loves to do that. Like if you read that piece again, and this is all on Discourse, by the way, But he loves to do that, these false dichotomies. On one side, you have the gas tank theory. On the other side, you have the brain. He'll talk about old models said this, but here's your new model. It's all this. Listen, I'll tell you this. It's a very effective way of bringing people along with you. And I think 10, 15 years ago, Tim decided that he wanted to show the world that you didn't need carbohydrates. And he's just, and I think, unfortunately, he's compromised some scientific integrity to do that.
We know that there are low-carb athletes, though, and low-carb, high-fat does work. He does actually mention that in the paper as well. And he says that their existence blows a huge hole in the idea that carbs are mandatory fuel for exercise. But we know that you can't sustain intense exercise.
Yeah, I note that the existence of, for every one of those, there's 10 to 100 people who are getting by with 90 grams, 100 grams, 120 grams an hour. Their existence doesn't blow a hole in the idea that you don't need carbs. The fact that they all are improving performance with it, right? So it's against
you wouldn't
cherry
win Kona.
You're not winning.
Zero carbs.
You're not winning much. And again, we've had on this podcast Louise Burke once and Jamie Whitfield twice. Jamie's a Discourse member. I hope he sees this and contributes to this discussion on Discourse. But they've done studies that have shown that elite athletes who are doing high-intensity exercise a lot of the time cannot sustain the training load and the training intensity without carbohydrates. And the other thing that's interesting, and Jamie said this last time we had him on, is when you have more carbs at 80 to 100 grams an hour, it's not necessarily that you're burning more energy and delaying the fatigue that would happen as a consequence of depletion of carbs. It's that you become more efficient. Your ability to produce energy is better when that energy is coming from carbohydrates. So your oxygen cost of exercise is actually lower when you're burning carbs than when you're burning fat. So again, why would you tell an athlete to be less efficient when there is a solution in front of them that would make them more efficient? Why would you tell an athlete to risk their central governor causing them to slow down when you could simply supply more of the energy and the central governor would never send that signal to slow down? It's just so unnecessary, And
I'd like to point out at this point in time that we are not sponsored by any fueling companies. So this is genuinely independent sort of
our only
take on this.
We're only sponsored by our Discourse members who pledge some money to support us every month. That's it.
We're not trying to sell you sugar.
No. Whereas I promise you, there's somewhere behind Tim in that list of co-authors, there are books and there are recipes and there are campaigns to sell you low carb.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So.
Speaking of Discourse, we'll hop on to a quick Ross Replies here because we had a fascinating post by Ian over on Discourse about recovery and recovery confusion, he calls it. He says, I don't wear my Garmin to sleep, so I have no HRV data, heart rate variability. As an alternative, I was told to try the following test, and this is one I'd never heard of. In the morning, lie down for 1 minute, press the lap button on your watch, then stand up for 1 minute and press lap again. Take the readings from these 2 laps and compare them with the maximum heart rate from this activity. Ideally, the difference between the first and the second, ideally the difference in the first lap and your maximum HR should be over 30 beats per minute before doing another hard session. Otherwise, it suggests that your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems aren't functioning optimally, meaning you may not fully absorb the training. He says he can't get anywhere near this 30 beats per minute difference. I have never heard of this test, and it sounds like it almost sounds concocted to me, almost bro science in its both simplicity and complexity.
It's not actually. It's actually a pretty validated, well-established test. And I'll read to you 2024 article by Thomas Gronwald, Orthostatic Testing for Heart Rate and Heart Rate Variability Monitoring in Exercise Science and Practice. And then a former guest of ours on the podcast is a guy called Marco Altini, who I think is credible. And he's written a piece called Monitoring Heart Rate Variability, Why the Orthostatic Stressor is Best and How to Make it Practical. Now, before I plow on, the orthostatic is the test that he's describing. And basically, it refers to a test where you lie down and then you stand up. And that's what orthostatic means. It's an orthostatic challenge. And the reason you would do this ever is because the process of standing up is a stress on the body. Believe it or not.
Not much of one.
Believe it. Enough of one that if you understand the stress and the body's response to it, there's potential, bold underlined word, all caps, potential value in how you interpret your training status or your recovery status. So what's happening when you lie down and then stand up quickly is gravity is imposed on your body when you stand. And as a consequence, the blood moves away from the center of the body and into the legs under the force of gravity. Makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So blood pressure drops when you stand up. That's why a lot of time people who get up too quickly have a head rush, and sometimes, I don't know if you've seen this, they actually faint.
Faint, yeah.
Yeah. That's a blood pressure reduction or sudden drop in response to this orthostatic stress. Now, most times it doesn't happen because the body is smart, and it says a couple things. Number one, heart rate must go up. Because when the heart rate goes up, the cardiac output goes up, and the blood pressure is restored back to normal. Now, the way that the heart rate goes up is two things happen. Number one, your parasympathetic nerve system, which is your relaxation system. It's the predominant nervous system that controls your body in situations of rest. You've heard of that? All the listeners, yes?
Yep.
Parasympathetic system goes down, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight, stress nervous system, goes up. That combination, parasympathetic down, sympathetic up, causes the heart rate to go up, among other things, but that's the main one. So the premise of this test is that the stress of standing up is a test of your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system responsiveness to stress. Yeah?
Right, okay. What's that got to do with recovery?
So when you are in a acutely fatigued or acutely compromised state, for instance, sick, majorly stressed out, had a big night the night before, you're still dealing with the consequences of alcohol on your body, what will happen there is that in going from lying down to standing up, your heart rate will overshoot. It'll go up a lot more because that stress is now seen as a bigger stress than it should actually have been.
Right, okay.
On the other hand, and this is where it gets confusing in the context of Ian's question, and this is why I would encourage people to read on Discourse to see all this discussed. When you are chronically overtrained, you've been doing a big block, weeks, potentially even longer, of hard training work. One of the consequences of being overtrained is that your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system are blunted in response to stress. So now this is going to get confusing because now when you impose a stress on the body, your sympathetic system is unable to mount a response and your parasympathetic system is unable to mount a response, and so now your heart rate goes up only a very small amount in response to that stress. So the same thing, stress, chronic stress or acute stress, can cause either a very large increase in heart rate or too small an increase in heart rate. Does that confuse you?
No, because I've read it, but I think it would otherwise.
Yeah, and this is where I would encourage listeners and people to reject the idea of a simple, if your heart rate goes up by 30, you're good to go. No.
That's what I was going to ask. Where does this 30 beats per minute figure come from?
Probably there are some studies that have looked at it, and they've said that in a normal, healthy individual who's not chronically overtrained, who's not had too much to drink, who's not sick, that's the average increase in heart rate when you go from lying down to standing up.
It's a fair whack, isn't it? 30 beats per minute. That's like double your outlet. Right?
Well, I mean, it could go from 60 to 90 peak, like pretty easily if you it's not uncommon. But again, if you tested 1,000 people, guarantee you there'll be people whose normal increase is 15, and there'll be some people whose normal increase might be 40 something. And that's the problem, is that we give advice to people based on averages, and individuals might make up an average, but they are still individuals within an average. So that's the first trap you have to avoid falling into, is don't over rely on one number. But the second one, the more complex one that I tried to explain to Ian on Discourse, is that increase in heart rate could mean two different things, depending on the circumstances that have created it. You could be acutely fatigued and it'll go up very large difference, But you could be chronically fatigued and it goes up a very small difference. But both are bad. And you have to be wise to that. And the only way to be wise to that, and this is the key message in my reply to Ian, is you've got to basically understand yourself, not what other people are doing. And so if you're going to do this orthostatic test for whatever reason, you need to spend 3 to 4 weeks measuring yourself in the absence of stress and get what is effectively your physiological fingerprint, your heart print, as it were. And then that gives you a baseline or a reference point. And then moving forward, you compare the changes to that reference point. Then if it goes up too much, you say why. And if it doesn't go up at all, and it looks like it's been suppressed, you ask why. And you can start to be a detective or a scientist, if you wish, by understanding your own pattern and the change that you see on day X relative to your historical pattern. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That was the really interesting part of the discourse discussion to me. Was this sort of getting your own baseline. Remember we talked about being your own scientist sort of thing. And then the discussion goes on to tech, doesn't it? It goes on to tech and data.
Yeah.
And perhaps look a bit more holistically at the whole of the way you feel and not just rely on this data.
Yeah, because by Ian's own admission, this was stressing him out. And I think it becomes a trap that we all fall into. We become enslaved by numbers and data because they sell so much, they promise so much to us. They say, if this happens, then that. You can now monitor training quality, training status, recovery status, performance indices that these smart watches and devices tell you. But they're all just models. And if they're not used in the right context, then no tool is useful. In fact, you can do a great deal of destruction if you use a tool the wrong way. And so my message to Ian was, you might be better off actually just not measuring. Well, by all means measure it, but don't worry about it for a month. Just collect it for the sake of learning. But the most powerful thing I think you can do, and I've done this myself and I've done it with athletes I've advised and worked with, is actually move away from the measurement of numbers and objective data and focus a little bit sometimes more on the subjective side. Make a diary for yourself of your training and how you felt. Even if you felt one sentence, legs felt pretty heavy today, really struggled on the last hill or something. Because by interrogating how I feel, I give context to the data, which I can then bring in at some later stage and join those two arguments, the subjective argument with the objective. I think that's where you unlock a lot more potential than just numbers. Because numbers, in the absence of that context, could lead you in exactly the wrong direction. That's the point about this heart rate thing. And I'll give you another example this happens at. Have you ever gone out for a run and you know that your heart rate's normally 140 beats per minute and all of a sudden it's 155, 160?
Yeah.
And you say, something's not right today. And sure enough, 2 days later, you're coughing at home in bed with pneumonia or something, for example. Maybe that's the problem. Or you're tired because you did your crazy cycle to a race, half marathon, cycle home thing. And the next day, your heart rate is higher. But if you ever had the opposite, where you go for a run and you say, wow, my heart rate's like 10 beats lower than normal.
That's because I'm super fit now.
Well, that's the problem. Sometimes that can be the cause. But if that happens acutely, and you know that you've been coming off 2 weeks of really hard training, that low heart rate is a sign of a problem waiting to happen, and you have to pay attention to it. But if you didn't keep a diary of subjective interpretations and how you felt, legs feel really tired, felt pretty sluggish, first time the road went uphill, I got a burn in my quads even though my heart rate was low, that combination of information is a sign that you need to train less hard for a little while, not more.
Do you remember we discussed that before? I think it was John posted on Discourse about about a cycling event he was doing.
Yes,
and he couldn't get his heart rate up.
That's right. Yes,
and it wasn't that you were fitter; it's because you fatigued.
Yeah, exactly. And it's such an interesting phenomenon. And it's the same thing that's in play in this orthostatic test. Is when you are chronically fatigued, your nervous system is just blunted, and it cannot mount a response to stress. So whether that stress is exercise, riding up a hill, not even a hill, just exercise, or going from lying down to standing up, your body just doesn't have the budget, the resources to spend on the stress, and that should be interpreted as a potential problem.
I like that idea, actually, of collecting the data. Keep collecting it, but just don't look at it.
Yeah, that's
and
the
then
key.
you've got your written record, and then you can go back, say in a month or a couple of months, and say on this day I was feeling great. How does the data then compare?
Yes,
Because
exactly.
you're not skewing what you're writing by saying, "Oh yeah, look at that."
Yeah, you
AI
can't.
has told me on Strava I was amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And like people now track heart rate variability at night and so forth. And what I remember doing with that when we interviewed Marco Altini is I kept a little logbook, and I'd wake up every morning, and before I measured it, before I saw a number, I'd write down my subjective perception. How did I sleep last night? And it tracks pretty well. But if I measured it and saw the score and then had to write it, I mean, it's meaningless because you've skewed it, you've biased it with access to the information. So what I would say is, and we can sort of put a bow on this here, is we do the discipline of asking ourselves how we felt subjectively. It might sound like the worst thing, like I got all this data, I got all the tech in the world, but the thing that really matters is how I felt. And the process of writing that down is intended to like just make us more aware, self-aware, and more connected to our physiology. Because I think if you over-rely on data, you get disconnected from your physiology, and you've got to fight against that.
Mm-hmm. Just before you put a bow on it, I was going to ask you, because you mentioned alcohol earlier on.
Yeah.
So after I did that ride to the half, run the half, ride back, I went straight to the pub on the way home. And that's not a good idea then. Is alcohol a real bad... Does that really hurt recovery that much? I'm just asking for a friend.
Look, at our level and the way we train and exercise, I don't think there's anything like majorly wrong with it. But in short, yes, it does.
Okay.
And I mean, in the studies, like I remember when Marco spoke to us, he said the single biggest harm that can be done to heart rate variability, for instance, is alcohol. It's the most obvious, ever-present, universally predictable impairer of your heart rate variability is a big night of drinking. So it affects us on a pretty significant level. But I would never say to someone, I mean, if you're an elite athlete and you've got in the middle of your world championships and you've just won the 10,000 meter title like Jimmy Gracia, I wouldn't be going out knowing I got to run a 5K a few days later. But for us, I mean, I reckon after doing that, you deserve a reward. I'd do the same.
Yeah, it's apples anyway when you're 5 a day. Speaking of health, actually, I just want to do a quick couple to finish off here.
Yeah.
One of which is about carbon monoxide in cycling again.
Yeah.
Because there was an article in the Times this week about Ineos. It was in February this year, literally the day that the UCI announced that they were publishing new rules on it on February the 1st. Ineos were testing their riders with carbon monoxide, and then in fact they tested them twice. And when asked about it at the time, they said they weren't doing it. And now somebody's come up and said, well, actually, we know you were doing it. They said, oh, yeah, actually, we were. And it amazes me that cycling keeps shooting itself in the foot like this.
Like you cannot get an honest answer to even a non-threatening question in cycling. I mean, like...
They were doing nothing wrong.
Exactly. Like it's like you should say, we use carbon monoxide because we invest heavily in altitude training, and carbon monoxide rebreathing is the best way to measure that our cyclists are responding to the altitude. And so therefore we use it within safe limits as exactly as it was intended to be used, and we are comfortable saying that. Like, just say that.
But they can't.
They just
can't.
Cycling is allergic to like an honest answer to even a non-threatening question. It's the same as like 15 years ago when ketones were discussed and they asked Chris Froome, I never heard of ketones. But everyone knew that the team was using ketones. Ketones weren't even banned. It's just a supplement. I reckon Pogacar was the same with the carbon monoxide. He made that sort of like attempt at a joke saying, isn't carbon monoxide the stuff that comes out of my dad's car? I've never heard of it. And like literally the same day, the team announced, yes, in fact, we do use it for its intended purpose of measuring hemoglobin. So like, if you can't answer straightforward questions in an honest way, then how is anyone ever going to have trust in what you say? It's just crazy.
And as they say, Pedersen, then they cry foul that we're always being judged by the mistakes of the past.
Yeah. I reckon there are some cyclists, if you challenge them about water, they'd say they don't drink it. Like that's how scared they are of admitting anything, It's just comical situations that come up, and then it gets held against them, and it will be, because you just cannot give people a credible, honest answer, even when it's non-threatening to you. Crazy.
Mm-hmm. And then finally is, I said last week we were talking about remember I mentioned the New Zealand rugby team?
Yeah, in the context of talent pathways, yeah.
Yeah, in the context of the Kenyan athletes being sort of, they call it athlete trafficking over to the US for the NCAA. Tony on Discourse pulled me up on this one, and I'm really glad he did. He said, basically, I was guilty of spreading another zombie idea that New Zealand poached South Sea Islanders for their rugby team. He says of more than 1,200 All Black players, only 82 have ever been born overseas. And of that number, the highest proportion came from Australia, followed by Britain. And half of those, so of that total of 82, came from those two countries. So he says about 40 All Blacks have been born in the Pacific Islands, and a large number of them came to the biggest emigration centre, which was New Zealand, as infants or preschoolers. So they certainly weren't poached. So over 120-year rugby history, a country that's the main emigration centre for Pacific Islanders, having maybe 1 in 35 of its All Blacks born in the islands, can't result in any accusation of poaching. So he's pretty much put me right there. So I'm guilty of these zombie ideas that run around. But it's common, isn't it? It's a common misconception, but it's so easy to make. So I'm just really glad of Discourse and Tony for putting me straight on that one, because it's a mistake I won't be making again.
I had heard that before, actually. I didn't pull you up on it on the show last week. And where I'd heard it in context is some time ago now, Gus Pichot, the former Argentine scrum half, was trying to run to be chairman of World Rugby. And one of his big, ticket items, campaign pledges or whatever you want to call it, was to clean up the emigration model in rugby union to make it more difficult to play where you weren't born. And I saw some analysis, and do you want to hazard a guess of the country that's had the fewest foreign-born players play for it at top-level international rugby?
Fewest foreign-born. South Africa.
No, I think it was second. Argentina is above us.
Which would make sense, seeing as it was Pichot that did.
Yes, exactly. So I think, and I mean, I hope I'm not spreading another zombie idea, but that's the one that had the fewest imports, as it were. But I mean, in the current day of globalization, and I think that was also a point Tony made, is you're going to get movement of players, and then you get second generation, third generation, etc. So it gets a little bit complex and untidy. It doesn't change the key point around, I know like France has got academies in Fiji, and as mentioned, they've got relationships with South African universities. People are trying to do that. Did you see the advert that Gerald posted on Discourse to get your attention about Wales?
Yeah, I did indeed. Basically, just as long as you know somebody who might have been to Wales once.
That's their participant expansion plan. My last and finally, Natalie Grabow. Did you see this name at all in the weekend?
No.
Became the oldest woman to finish the Kona Ironman, over 80.
I wrote about that and caught my eye this morning. I just didn't put two and two together. Yeah.
That was the name.
I never remember. 16 hours something.
I never remember a name. 16:45. I always remember a time. I never remember a name, but I made a concerted effort to remember Natalie Grabow, who finished the Ironman, was the first person ever over 80 to finish Kona Ironman.
Did you know that she only learned to swim at 59?
Huh. I didn't know that, so you're ahead of me on context.
That's pretty impressive, because what I was writing about caught my eye was I read an interview with her, and she was saying that in the 70s, when she grew up, women weren't really not allowed to do sport, but there just weren't opportunities then. So it's only in later life she's really taken the opportunity. And it reminded me of the 1972 New York Marathon. Do you remember? Do you ever read about that? With the Six That Sat, I think it was called.
Oh, no, I hadn't heard of that one. I remember the Bobby Gibb Boston Marathon, when Roberta Gibb entered as Bobby Gibb and tried to disguise herself as a man in order to run that race. But I didn't know about the New York one. Why did they sit?
They sat because, off the top of my head, they were allowed to run it because at the time women weren't allowed to run marathon in case your uterus fell out or something. The doctors had these ridiculous reasons.
Yeah.
But they had to start it 10 minutes earlier than the official start. And they said, no, we're not doing that. So they just sat down and protested at the start line. I might have completely ballsed that story up, but it's worth having a read. I think, in fact, it was one of Malcolm Gladwell's podcasts. I think, or was it ESPN? One or the other. The Six That Sat. There's a great podcast about it. We'll put it in the show notes.
We will. What trivia we ended off today. Good stuff.
Yeah, we have. Sorry, I just totally went off on one there.
No, that's the point. And finally, that is and finally though. So we're going to wrap it up. I told you it'll be a fun one. I think this was a cool, really enjoyable one. I hope the thread that ran through those stories about pacing, fatigue, regulation, and all the way through even Ian's question about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and recovery made sense to you all. If it didn't, Discourse is the place to go and make sense of it, because either our listeners will clarify the things that we got wrong, as you've heard, or we'll go on there and add some thoughts to what was discussed on this podcast. So again, you know what to do. That, as Gareth pointed out, is our only form of sponsorship, is your support. And you get a lot out of it as well. I'm not biased, but that's the truth. For now, though, that's another spotlight in the bag. We will see you all again next week. Keep the discourse going and keep training, and see you all next time. Ciao. Okay, done.